Hello, One Book, One Norristown community. I am Chris Dormer, proud to be the Superintendent of Schools of the Norristown Area School District, and I'm going to be completing Chapter 10 of Lorene Cary's The Price of a Child. The public cemetery for paupers lay a few blocks away. The men hoisted the box onto a carter's dray, handed him $50, and told him they'd follow on foot. Earlier that day, Cary had stopped to pay a bribe to the city caretaker, who muttered about digging the hole, and then muttered again because he wanted a larger bribe than Cary had given him. Ephraim closed the church. They heard the doors bang behind them as the dray clattered away, bobbing the cheap coffin under carelessly tied ropes. Harriet took the children back to the schoolroom to help her clean up for the night. Cary, Blanche, Della, Mercer, Sharkey, and Jim Freeman, with two of the men who'd accompanied him, walked behind the dray. At the pauper's graveyard, they helped Cary hoist the box off the wagon and across the frozen ground to the shallow hole the men had dug. The box had no handles. They jostled it and felt the awkward weight of the body. The men took turns shoveling dirt in, just so they'd be sure Nignag would actually get the hole Cary had paid for. "He looks so alone," Mercer said. "He is alone," Cary answered. He took his turn at the shovel and passed it on. "And he died alone, poor soul, like a dog. But we are here now, and I suppose that's something. Not much, though, for the powerful thing he did in a powerless life." The Quicks and Mercer shook hands with Jim Freeman and his friends in the bleak gray. On the way home, the Quicks met Manny. "Oh, Jesus," Della said, "my husband is losing his mind." Manny wore 2 cravats and no overcoat. Della had not drawn on his mustache. His face looked naked, with gray hairs of his natural mustache wispy and frail. He walked unsteadily. "Are you going to the funeral?" he asked. "Funeral's over, Mr. Quick," Della said. Cary stood still frowning. "Why are you wearing 2 cravats, Daddy?" "Huh? Oh, don't, Cary," Blanche said. Cary frowned at her too. "How will we know if we don't tell him?" "He fell again last night, and his eyes were just shaking back and forth something awful, Ty. Don't scold your own father," she said. "He got himself out here, didn't he?" "That's it," Manny said eagerly. "That's it, Ty. Now run home. I'll be along." "Go on," Sharkey said to the women. "Cary and I'll stay with them. Go on home." They left. Behind them they heard the 3 men arguing. No one spoke until they arrived at the Quicks' house. Abby Ann was sitting in the parlor waiting for someone to make tea. When they came home, Blanche told her in detail about the service. Abby Ann became furious when she heard that Ephraim had used the Song of Solomon verses. "That was for our wedding," she said before stomping upstairs. That night, Mercer and Harriet took out each other's hair, as was their custom, brushed and oiled it, braided it tight to make it straight, and then tied it with kerchiefs. "Miss Harriet," Mercer said in the dark, "if I write to Miss Randall tomorrow, will you read my letter and correct it for me?" "You're going to speak?" "Yes. Just because Nignag died? You don't have to, you know." "Yes, I do." Once Mercer committed herself to the tour, Cary and Harriet accelerated the pace of her studies. On one night, Cary announced that he would take her to hear a lecture given by his friend. "Not that man Silver, I hope," said Della. "Yes, Silver, Mother." "Oh no, he's the most arrogant thing." Blanche looked worried. Roland and Silver had become friends too, and Silver was for emigration to Africa. Cary had threatened before to take Mercer to hear him, but he hadn't time. "She doesn't need to hear them, Cary." "Yes, she does. I'll take Sharkey to protect her from pernicious ideas." At 7:15, Cary, Sharkey, and Mercer stepped out of the light rain into one half of the parlor of Mrs. Sadler's boarding house. Mrs. Sadler's husband, now dead, had created a large-capacity boarding house years before by punching an archway in the common wall of 2 adjoining houses. The parlor was so large that groups that chose to avoid the cost of a hall would come to Mrs. Sadler with a few dollars and a date. The African and Caribbean immigration groups chose Mrs. Sadler's because she was a democratic lady, and unlike the proprietors of most privately owned residences, did not mind sponsoring groups she disagreed with, so long as they paid promptly. Cary spotted the evening speaker, Wayland Silver, through the doorway in Mrs. Sadler's dining room, drinking something before he began. He put his cup down and strode toward Tyree with open arms. They embraced without words and held each other. Sharkey explained to Mercer that Silver had attended Thetford Academy in Vermont with Roland and Tyree, and together Roland and Silver had decided they were going to Africa. They had a falling out just before Roland was killed. How do they look? Silver asked Tyree, referring to the people who were assembled in the parlor. Stiff. Ha! They always look stiff, Silver said in a whisper. He shook Sharkey's hand and stood in front of Mercer while Tyree introduced them. I'm honored to make your acquaintance, Miss Gray. I followed your story with interest and sympathy. You'll never know how many people you've inspired or how many prayers you've received. Silver looked at Mercer appraisingly with his small, black, mischievous eyes. He exuded health and charm and critical judgment, sharp and active. We brought Mercer to hear your brand of speechifying, Wayland, Sharkey said, because the abolitionists have engaged her to speak in New England in the spring. Have you any advice for her? Take your winter clothes, he said. His smile remains as engaging, but Mercer thought she saw him take her measure with his own personal tape. What they call spring there isn't, and I hope you'll not be too offended by what I say tonight. There's freedom, and there's freedom. I don't understand what you mean, Mercer said. No, I shouldn't think you would. Don't be Delphic, Silver. We bought Miss Gray because we thought she'd be interested in your views. Silver raised an eyebrow. He took a deep breath and spoke wearily, sometimes looking at Mercer, sometimes looking through the doorway into the parlor, which was almost full by now. I'll tell you the truth, he said. The Negro Emigrationist Society has sent me, has paid me, or will pay me, and soon, I hope, to convince African Americans to return to Africa. I know, of course, that this scheme will be of greatest benefit to those who had money to make the greatest investment. Not these people here, but the businessmen who've sent me, and are paying me, or will pay me soon. I do not approve of this situation, but I accept their money. All of us, Miss Gray, are working for someone. Most lecturers are too vain or too naive to keep that in mind, but it's true. What I want to do is keep giving these men facts and more facts, such as a few of them would read in the Liberator, or the Anglo-African, or the Christian Recorder, those few of them who can and do read. We are a thinking people, capable of pride and strong feeling, but we have so few alternatives for our moral and political thoughts, except for the word on the street or the word in the pulpit. Silver's eyes narrowed to slits, and his carved lips sneered under his mustache. Preachers, literary societies, Freemason groups, all of them, Miss Gray, like to give their poor brothers the predictable uplift harangue. Frugality, temperance, modesty. And yet, they know good and well that these men out here are headed back to their alleys as soon as we finish speechifying at them, for a belt of whatever they can afford. Know what I call it? Race pudding. Negro speakers spoon it out, and Negro audiences suck it up, night after night, in parlors from Boston to the Mason-Dixon line. It is that and a pious churchy mandate for gratitude that will enslave the rest of us as surely as our brothers in chains are enslaved in the South. Our leaders, you see, don't want to be embarrassed, so they must keep us nice and quiet. So, there, Tyree, have I been a beast to your lady speaker? No, sir, I've been through plenty enough, Mercer answered him in an even voice, making sure, as Harriet had drilled her, not to say, I've been to this man. You don't scare me. Well, good, he said. He seemed sincere, and Mercer was confused. So, Tyree said, you got more speech left, nigger? Go to hell, Wayland said. Tyree and Sharkey laughed. They wished Silver well, and went to claim seats at the back of the room. 36 people, mostly men, shifted in Mrs. Sadler's motley collection of wooden chairs, cast-offs from the deceased Mrs. Sadler's many white employers. Much of the stiffness Tyree had noticed was caused by the unpredictability of their mounts, which, besides being old and wobbly, were likely to give off splinters. They have come for uplift, Tyree whispered to Mercer, or at least for comfort. I think we do come hoping for some comfort at least, or hope. Silver may have a hard time selling them. Hope, Mercer said, her eyes bright. I never thought of that. Wayland Silver smiled, but not too broadly, as he walked to the front of the parlor. He dressed that evening in simple clothes, but they were all made of rich fabric. If he were poorly dressed, they would doubt his credibility, and if too well dressed, his sincerity. As it was, the men calculated the cost of his waistcoat, and they were alert for insult. They knew that Wayland Silver had had everything a colored man could want in life, and was not satisfied. In a moment he would become, in their eyes, an educated Negro speaking treachery. They were uneducated and poor, despised by the common white man, and hemmed in by law and custom. Men who lined their shoes with hot pepper to ward off the cold did not need to be told that they'd done a bad job of shoeing themselves. Silver proceeded slowly and cautiously, invoking divine providence. He was determined to touch the folk who resisted him. Their eyes warned him to begin gently as he attacked the good white folk who gave blankets to colored widows and ran homes for colored orphans. But he would attack, not because he was expected any of them to pack their bags for Africa tomorrow, but precisely because they never dared to dream of it. He started by thanking Mrs. Sadler for the room, thanking the people for coming, giving honor and glory to God. That done, he launched in. 20 years ago, when my father and my uncle and several people had begun their work on what some people like to call the Underground Railroad, the New England Anti-Slavery Society decided to build a school for colored men and women to receive manual training. Now that same year, the National Negro Convention met with colored delegates from New York, Ohio, Illinois, New England, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Point South. Perhaps you remember, they voted for support for the school, and Mr. Lloyd Garrison, the most famous abolition leader, took off for England to raise the funds. But the next year, when Mr. Garrett Smith opened his school in Peterborough, New York, or when the Institute for Colored Youth was established here in Philadelphia, did Mr. Garrison hail them? Did he mention them with pride and admiration? Did he run out and raise money for them? Two new institutions carrying on the good work that he has said must go on throughout the country. Well, you'd think he would, wouldn't you? You'd think he would, but I'd afraid you be wrong. Mr. Garrison would have nothing to do with them. Not a thing. And why not? Because they weren't his schools. You hear what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen? Here were places where our people would be able to receive the education that Mr. Garrison claims to want us to get. It's just he wants us to come to him for it. We have some friends, my brothers and sisters, who enjoy helping so very much that they don't want anyone else to have the pleasure. Why, some of our so-called friends have gotten so used to caring for us that they don't even like it when we take care of ourselves. Some of our friends, this is a terrible thing to have to say, but it's true. Some of them would rather see us sink in ignorance and despair than find our own way to freedom. We must open our eyes and see our friends. God knows the abolitionists are our friends. They do toil mightily in our cause, but we must know our friends for who and what they are. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that we have friends who love us, some too well and some not well enough. We have friends, but they cannot do for us what we must do for ourselves. They cannot decide our destiny for us. They cannot push us there. I forgot, by the way, to tell you what happened to Mr. Garrison's school. You know, the Institute for Colored Youth right over there in Lombard Street is thriving, and the Peterborough School is growing too. Mr. Garrison's school, however, ran into some difficulty, I'm afraid. He had them. The people in the adjoining parlors began to shake their heads. "Oh, Lord," said an albino preacher, an itinerant who came to court Mrs. Sadler each time he passed through Philadelphia. "Well, tell it." "Yes, sir, I will," Silver responded. "I'll tell you that at first they were going to build a separate colored school, and then they changed their minds. But once the Negro students enrolled with the others," he said, shaking his head. "Once they were enrolled, I say, and just as they were about to begin the school year, it became clear that Mr. Garrison, at all, had misjudged the situation." Now, this was happening in New Canaan, New Hampshire, but no one had talked about it to the New Canaanites. The fact was they didn't like the plan, didn't like it at all. So when the young people were all set to begin school, the townspeople hitched a team of oxen and began pulling the building down. Just like that, tore it down, so there was no school. There is no school. Silver watched the bitter half smiles. Sharkey nodded his head and raised an eyebrow. Mercer frowned slightly with concentration. The story had twists and turns she was trying to follow. We need to know our friends. We need to study those who would free us from slavery only to deliver us into second-class citizenship. They sold my granddaddy as a quarter hand when he was 6, then a half hand when he was 10, and a full hand when he was 18, and able to earn another man's fortune for him. Where in America can we earn our own fortunes? Silver paused. Rain was falling hard now and coming in the windows. A few men jumped up to close them. The parlor became suddenly quiet and steamy. You see, Silver said, there are no garrisons in Liberia. They do not ask Mother May I in Haiti. In Yorubaland and the Niger River Valley, where the butterfly travels in clouds of color, or in the gentle rolling hills of Central America, black men and women do not have to buy their aging parents out of slavery or hire their children to do the work of grown men. Mercer could not stop watching or listening to him. Every thought, every word he made her feel exhausted, as if she'd come so far and paid so dear for nothing. But the phrase about buying old parents stuck in her head. Yes, 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 it was a scandal to have to do it, but could it be done? And would he and the others help? A young man asked me the other day, Silver continued in the hushed room, how I could possibly trust the whites in the American Colonization Society to have our best interests at heart. Well, let me tell you, I do not. I do not trust them. I do not trust the New York Herald, which urged the government to encourage us to emigrate to Liberia because our racial inferiority makes us a burden on the United States. You know as well as I do when the American Colonization Society made its first overtures to Africans here in Philadelphia in 1817, before many of us were even born, 3,000 men and women thronged Bethel AME to protest. And since then, of course, most of us have even refused to call out ourselves Africans. So afraid are we that someone might notice and send us back. Although no matter what we call ourselves, I'll wager they still know an African when they see one. They laughed. I see. Folks, have you noticed all too, eh? But as I was saying, I do not trust the state legislatures that have given upwards of $35,000 each towards schemes to send colored Americans to Africa. I do not trust the Virginia politicians who have levied a tax on the free colored men of their state for the purpose of raising emigration money. Huh? I do not trust any of them, and I say to you, my brethren, neither should you. From inside the kitchen, Mercer heard the rattling of cups. Silver had said they had paid Mrs. Sadler extra to pour tea for the audience after the talk. It made people feel part of something prosperous. Silver wiped his face and breathed and went on. Mercer could see he was winding up. She could not tell where he was going. But I do trust our own, gentlemen and ladies. I do trust Dr. Martin Delaney, graduate of Harvard University Medical School and Pittsburgh's most prominent colored citizen, who just last year considered the issue of Negro emancipation in his excellent work, The Condition, Elevation, Emigration, and Destiny of Colored People of the United States. Dr. Delaney advocates what he calls a Negro promised land in South America. I do trust the Reverend Samuel Williams of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, who took a party to Liberia and has returned so deeply impressed by the sight of free black men on free black soil that he's organized the Liberian Enterprise Company to encourage us Pennsylvanians to consider, just consider, mind you, that there might be an alternative to the fractional hand status we endure in this place that we can only advisedly call home. The men clapped and shouted. The few women clapped too. Silver mopped his face. The sycophantic writer from the Christian Recorder shook his head. Even those who were appalled at the thought of sailing farther than the mouth of the Delaware Bay pumped each other's arms. Mercer thought she knew what Cary had wanted her to see. She made a bow towards Silver, and he nodded back with a weary smile.